Let me first ask you about the Brexit situation, since that seems front and center right now. How much does Nicola Sturgeon's call for another independence vote threaten England's ratings?
It does, just like it did the first time around when there was a referendum in Scotland. We made it quite clear that if Scotland were to become an independent country and the remaining UK was left with the government debt stock, such as it is, it would go up by around 10 percentage points of GDP. We think the number's a little bit lower than that, but the result is the same. So that would be one negative implication from a rating perspective for the remaining UK. The other would be to do with the banks and UK banks' newfound international exposures, et cetera. So I think it would be a negative this time, just as it was the first time, potentially.
Are you concerned about the banks leaving London? Is that a major concern as far as a ratings perspective?
No. I mean, that's a separate issue. That's more of the UK leaving the EU than Scotland and potentially England. But that was an issue with respect to the Scottish referendum, just because there were banks in Scotland and banks in England which would have international exposures which weren't international prior to that. Not a huge deal. I think the bigger deal is the debt.
What do you think about the timing of negotiations, or the uncertainty, really, of the outcome? How much does that affect investors' assessment of debt?
Yeah, I think with respect to Brexit itself, the big unknown is what's going to happen after Article 50 is triggered, right? How much is 2 years really enough to get a comprehensive free trade agreement between the UK and the EU? Nobody really knows. And it's not clear if the full 2 years will be set aside to negotiate free trade, because European leaders want to do some other things first, such as settle a Brexit bill and things like that. So I think there's going to be a lot of uncertainty. A lot of stuff is probably going to get packed into the last part of the negotiations. There's going to be a lot left on the table with 6 months to go, and therefore a lot of uncertainty as to how it all wraps up.
Are you expecting anything on the timing or on Brexit from this upcoming G20 meeting of finance ministers?
No, I don't think so. I think this G20 meeting is really all about, meeting the Americans and figuring out what the U.S. agenda is, and whether or not some of the rhetoric and bluster that we've heard in the presidential election campaign and from the White House subsequently, whether that's a little bit more nuanced, shall we say, from U.S. government officials. So I think it's very much about figuring out what some of the U.S. policy announcements might mean, and seeing, just where the U.S. stands. Is
the U.S. team, you think, ready to be fully engaged with this G20 meeting?
Well, if the media reports are anything to go by, and maybe they are, maybe they're not, there's still a lot of indecision in the White House on some of the basic policies with respect to trade and tax reform. I think some of those issues haven't been settled, so it's difficult to come with a definitive plan and strategy that could be shared amongst other leaders when it hasn't really been resolved yet in D.C. itself.
Nonetheless, there are still some negative consequences of the policy that we hear being talked about, at least as far as your team is concerned, for, say, Canada or Mexico.
Well, certainly, I think in the longer term, some of the protectionist measures that have been alluded to by the U.S. would have negative consequences for neighboring countries. The two you mentioned are the most obvious. I guess China's probably another one. But the U.S. has mentioned a number of countries, and if there were migration restrictions, then that would hurt a number of Central American economies that rely a lot on remittances. So there's plenty to go around in terms of negative implications if the U.S. were to go down this sort of protectionist road.
Migration's a huge issue in the U.S., but also here in Europe. Let me bring it back to the continent. Are you concerned about the Dutch issue with Turkey?
Not specifically, but I think the broader context is one that we do worry about. We're not expecting political shocks per se in 2017, but we think this sort of lingering negative anti-EU sentiment will persist and will affect policymaking going forward. It leaves Europe a little bit more vulnerable to crises in the medium term, maybe a little bit less commitment to sort of fiscal rules and other measures that bring Europe together. So I think the underlying tendencies are really more what we worry about, that rather than specific episodes like that.
How closely are you watching Dutch elections today?
Very closely, but the typical pattern in Dutch elections for more than a century is coalition. So it's going to take months to probably figure out who is going to be in that governing coalition. So I don't think we'll find out very much today or tomorrow.